Today we're having a look at the plan for the post-war countryside, which is really important because it gives us the situation that we're in today. And it's also very topical because the new Labour government is about to release their New Deal for the countryside. So it would be useful to have a look at the last time there was a visionary plan for a modern landscape. During the Second World War, the British government produced a series of reports that investigated how different parts of society should function in modern Britain. The most famous of these was the Beveridge Report, the recommendations of which became the basis of the welfare state. The Barlow Commission had already looked at the geographical distribution of the industrial population within Britain, and the Uthwatt Report looked at the financial aspect of planning, compensation for landowners, stuff like that. If you wanted to build new towns like Milton Keynes, you'd have to pay the dispossessed landowners. But the actual plan for the countryside was contained in the 1942 Report on Land Utilisation in Rural Areas. This is often called the Scott Report because the committee that wrote it was chaired by Lord Justice Leslie Scott. The Scott Report was essentially the basis of the 1947 Town and Country Planning Act, and it marked the end of the debate around the role the countryside should play in modern Britain that had been raging throughout the 1920s and 30s. We've covered this debate already, but they asked all the same questions we're asking today. Where should our food come from? What should the food be? Who should own the land? Who should work the land? Should urban people have access to the land? What should the role of nature be? The debate is exactly the same, and the Scott Report essentially sides with George Stapledon, who had a vision of small, owner-occupying farmers operating a system of mixed farming and maintaining healthy rural communities. But the committee behind the Scott Report wasn't allowed to comment on agricultural policy. We've covered the agricultural part of the post-war settlement already. The Scott Report was entirely about culture, land use, buildings, ultimately townspeople. How can the countryside serve the uniquely urbanised population of Britain? The committee that drew up the report consisted of 12 members, 11 of whom signed it. The chairman was the Lord Justice of Appeal, Leslie Scott. Prominent geographer Dudley, who we have briefly mentioned before, was the vice-chairman. The committee had a representative of each of the rural social classes, a landowner in the House of Lords, a farmer and an agricultural labourers representative. There was a female county councillor, the head of the Women's Land Army, an industrialist, a leading wholesaler, a well-known surveyor and a traffic expert. The only dissident note came from a professor of economics trained in the laissez-faire school. Previously, these interest groups had all been on different sides of the debate. Before the war, the food policy had been to import whatever we could as cheaply as possible, which was to benefit industrialists who could pay lower wages and produce goods for export more competitively. And we've seen the conflict between farmers and the aristocracy that existed from enclosure to the Second World War, because both of these classes wanted control of the land. But representatives from all of these different groups, from both the countryside and the town, are able to agree with the findings of the report. An aristocrat, an industrialist and a farm labourer's representative all come together to sign this off. And that is the thing that's really beautiful about this moment in British history. There is a genuine wish across society for people to work together and make things better for everybody. But it is telling that an economics professor wouldn't put his name to the report. He essentially argued that if the free market wasn't providing something, that meant that collectively as a society, we didn't want it. To him, the Scott Report was trying to subsidise what many agricultural scientists considered to be an inefficient system of agriculture, and this would have to be paid for by taxes and therefore would represent a financial hit on the nation as a whole. The argument against this was simply that there is a difference between the private benefit of a good consumed and the social benefit, which is not always reflected in the price at market. The reason why many of us wish to see agriculture maintained and house building restricted is that agriculture has hitherto provided us with the use of land as a free good for many purposes. We have been free, within limits, to walk over it, picnic on it, enjoy its beauties and feel, quite improperly, shareholders in it. Building not only creates a wen on the face of the countryside, it also takes this free good from us. Between the wars, a lack of government intervention meant strip development had occurred along roads, ruining the countryside with ugly, cheap houses while being a really inefficient layout for communities. People in these houses would have to drive everywhere, so they ruin the countryside without conferring the benefits of the town. In protecting the countryside from the free market, the Scott Report was endorsing things that would cost money but would give cultural benefits. The report begins by saying the committee is united and that they respect farmers who had proven themselves to be versatile, hard-working and intelligent citizens during the war. We are united in sharing a deep love for our countryside that it is our duty to preserve for our children and our children's children. That's us. We are unable to subscribe in any way to the view that the countryman is inferior to the townsman. We do not want a countryside which behind a smiling face hides much human poverty and misery. They acknowledge the prevalence of malnutrition in the British population before the war and presume that any British government would continue to support a progressive agriculture. But they also recognise that their vision would require the cooperation of the entire population. Much that we propose requires goodwill rather than money. The committee observed that with personal transport, the village and market town had declined, and farmers had cut costs during the Depression by reducing labour and neglecting basic maintenance of hedges and ditches. This had caused people to drift from the depressed villages to the cities. Pre-war attempts to stop this decline, such as guaranteed milk prices, only slowed it, so it was clear to the people behind the Scott Report that something more radical was needed if rural culture was to be preserved into the modern age. The Scott Report held villages to be incredibly important to British society. In essence, they're asking a question about how people should live in the modern age, and they want a genuine traditional community. It is a rare exception for a villager to be left out and to be forced to live a lonely life in a functioning village, and the loss of these communities is their problem with pre-war development. The encroachment of the town was wasteful of agricultural land, but also inimical to development of any real community life. In this, I think they were influenced by the writers in the aristocratic organic movement. Lord Limington and his friends emphasised the importance of village communities because if a peasant was looked after by his community, the state wouldn't need to provide healthcare or a pension, and then that would mean they wouldn't have to tax the aristocracy to fund a welfare state. The Scott Report emphasises the cultural importance of the village in a similar way, but it does so not for the benefit of the lord, but for the people. It takes a distinctly anti-aristocratic line. They want the village social structure to be preserved, but freed from the paternalistic, or it may be dictatorial, influence of the squire, the local landowner. This is very important because it was a declaration that the countryside after the war had no place for the aristocratic class. It's for the people, and the aristocracy no longer feel welcome, so many of them, including Limington himself, disappear off to the colonies for a few decades to escape the Scott Report's vision of a modern countryside. So the Scott Report sides with farmers in their conflicts with the aristocracy, but the report as a whole is much more concerned with the conflict between town and country. They've observed that country people and townsfolk do not get on, and I think they're very sympathetic to the position of country people in this. They observe that resentment was usually based on a lack of understanding of country ways too frequently exhibited by the townsmen. Open-air organisations are excellent movements, but townspeople have to learn again how to use the countryside for their own sakes and for the sakes of others. And the infrastructure that has been built to accommodate these disrespectful townspeople as they come into the countryside on holiday or for walks is also viewed very negatively. Wayside cafes, snack bars, filling stations and such like cannot properly claim the dignity of being described as buildings. The fundamental problem the Scott Report was trying to fix is that townspeople and country people are very different and they hate each other. But the countryside is the heritage of all, and townspeople had a right to enjoy it. And like George Stapledon, the committee who wrote the Scott Report considered it very important for society as a whole that townspeople could have a healthy relationship with their environment. Mutual understanding and sympathy is necessary if all sections of the country are to enjoy the countryside, which, if it is the heritage of all, is in the guardianship of the countryman. As they acknowledged, this required goodwill rather than money. Tax revenue can't buy sympathy and mutual understanding, but they looked to the experiences of the Women's Land Army with great hope. The Women's Land Army show that many townswomen, especially when confronted with a choice between factory and farm, have a preference for the country life and are able to adapt themselves to country conditions. And evacuated children have shown a growing interest. So they think the experience of the Second World War proves that the divide between town and country can be bridged. They propose educational campaigns in schools and workplaces, posters and films in cinemas to encourage tolerance and mutual understanding between town and country. These are the films that I use on this channel. Most of them are essentially pro-farmer propaganda, saying, look, farmers are hard-working and educated and resourceful. They should be respected as professionals rather than looked down upon. And the committee thought that they could see this working already during the war, as farmers and people from the towns came together to build an efficient agriculture after the Depression. The greater prosperity of agriculture has reduced the friction which has so often resulted from contact of urban and rural mentalities. But if townspeople are to enjoy the modern countryside and integrate with their fellow rural citizens, the countryside must be kept beautiful for them. The report wanted a central planning authority to stop uncontrolled or ugly development and ensure efficient town planning. This would preserve beauty and preserve the agricultural landscape, but it's also modern Britain, remember. They want things to be efficient. This desire for efficiency was tied to their sense of beauty. They don't really like nature, remember. They don't like natural social hierarchy, they don't like the aristocracy, they don't like the natural allocation of resources, they don't like the free market. And they also don't really like natural landscapes. The landscape should be designed to be better than natural, more efficient and more beautiful. They have a very strange perception in this period that pylons are beautiful. One of the books I have describes them as having a real beauty that no one can deny, which today seems crazy, but I think it's because they're efficient and orderly. They're symbols of a modern society. To me, pylons are horrendously ugly, but I think wind turbines are very beautiful and they don't spoil the landscape at all, which is perhaps a similar thing. I see wind turbines as giant monuments towering over the landscape that symbolise technological advancement and a productive countryside generating power in a renewable way. Perhaps people in 100 years will see these as horrendously ugly as we see pylons. In the same way that the subsidies for farmers were for the benefit of the consumer, the urban working class, the Scott Report's landscape was designed entirely for the benefit of townspeople. The landscape is for recreation. They're getting designated national parks and green belts. The report said the main purpose of agriculture in national parks was public recreation. This was even more important than food. They wanted to increase the number of youth hostels and campsites, commercial holiday camps and holiday villages, all in line with the proposals made by George Stapleton. The landscape would be preserved in its rural state for the enjoyment of holidaymakers. The report found that the cheapest way, indeed the only way, of preserving the countryside in anything like its traditional aspect would still be to farm it. It described it as a utilitarian landscape with incidental beauty, parcelled into a patchwork of fields. Not natural beauty, again, it's a productive, efficient, working landscape. It's designed by people, for people. But alongside this, they were very keen to protect rural culture. Farmers would need to be preserved if they were to continue being the landscape gardeners of Britain. But the people who had been leaving villages before the war did so because the towns offered them a better quality of life. To stop this, the Scott Report wanted villages to be provided with amenities at the same standard you would expect in towns. If villages had pharmacies and clinics and libraries and schools and shops and there was an agricultural minimum wage, then the quality of life in villages would be the same as the town and rural culture would be preserved. And another cultural protection the countryside was given was the humble village hall. The cardinal problem is how to refocus cultural life within the village itself. The report wanted a community or social centre for every village, a village hall with a committee room and a kitchen. The 1947 Town and Country Planning Act that stemmed from the Scott Report gave us much to be thankful for. Planning permission meant that just owning land didn't give you right to develop it, and they introduced the listed building system that stops people tampering with historic or culturally important buildings. And there were measures to control outdoor advertising. British roads are remarkably free from adverts, which is a good thing. And the objective of national parks was to allow urban and rural to mix together and have them unite into a single British people. A society of tolerant, enlightened citizens with a genuine connection to each other and the land. I really like the Scott Report. Some of it worked really well. It did largely preserve the countryside with planning permission and national parks. In physical terms, I think we could consider it a success. It stopped strip development, preserved our village structure, and we still have our green and pleasant land. But some of it didn't work very well at all. It completely failed to smooth over the cultural chasm between town and country, which now is even more savage than ever. This was for two reasons. Mechanisation continued to reduce the rural workforce, which they somehow didn't see coming. I think this is because during the war agriculture was mechanised, but they also needed lots of additional labour to undo the decay from the Depression. But once all the ditching and draining had been completed, that labour wasn't needed anymore, and rural communities continued to decline. The other reason this fails is because townspeople lacked the goodwill required to mix with country people. It just doesn't happen. British villages today are not traditional rural communities. They function essentially as suburbs. But the report itself did say that smoothing over this cultural divide would require goodwill rather than money. It is a cultural thing. So even though it failed in the long term, and now we're having this debate about land all over again, I think the Scott Report was commendable in that it did identify the problems correctly. The Scott Report's committee came together to try to build a country that was beautiful and fair, and a society that was tolerant and would work for everybody. We'll talk more about the failure of the Scott Report to make town and country mix in the future, but I would just like to briefly contrast its aims with what the government is doing at the moment. The recent budget has sparked a culture war about the role of farmers within society. All this crap in the media at the moment is a perfect example of how modern society often makes farmers feel not only misunderstood and unappreciated, but often actively unwanted. We're not made to feel welcome in our own environment. But while all this is going on, we are just normal people trying our best to keep our environment healthy and beautiful. But this means that the modern landscape preserved by the Scott Report is currently under threat. A lot of it is being preserved by sheer force of will from farmers themselves. There are lots of companies offering a lot of money to put solar panels on land. We all get pamphlets about it through our door, offering a stable income for no work at all, which is financially a great offer. But as you drive through the countryside, you will not see many solar panels because farmers collectively are saying no, that's not what we think land should be used for. Farmers collectively are turning money away in order to preserve the productive landscape the Scott Report tried to protect. And today, the whole debate that led up to the Scott Report is happening again. People write articles saying the Scott Report got its definition of beauty wrong. This is a Geography Cambridge graduate who argues that we need to redefine beauty to mean a landscape that is not ordered and efficient, but one that is natural and doesn't have much agriculture happening. She believes in no-mow May, June, July, August and September, which for those of you without practical experience of agriculture means come October you get a pretty rubbish crop. This article is pushing for a different vision of beauty, and the landscape it wants won't produce much food. One of the main arguments of this channel is that what we recognise as environmentalism today is actually just rural politics, and like all politics, it's about class and it's about economics. There are different environmentalisms. The Scott Report, I think, is an environmentalism. It's intended to preserve the landscape for future generations. The Scott Report intervened in the class war between farmers and the aristocracy, the battle for the control of the land. It said, we will have a farmed landscape for the benefit of townspeople who will need its food and who will enjoy its beauty. The farmer, the small owner-occupier, will be its guardian with the guidance of the scientist and the agricultural engineer. In this countryside, there would be no place for the paternal or dictatorial influence of the aristocracy. But this idea that the anti-aristocratic Scott Report got its definition of beauty wrong stems from the aristocracy. The author of this article, trying to redefine rural beauty, is employed by the Nepa state, the aristocratic class, and the same family behind the rewilding movement. And their vision of an unfarmed wild landscape is politically the opposite of the Scott Report. It's a landscape that has aristocrats who don't work, but not farmers. This is a class conflict. It's about control of land and it's economic. The author is the head of natural capital at NEP, focusing on levering emerging natural capital markets. That's the objective here. The aristocracy are doing what they've done since enclosure. They appeal to nature to justify their social position. They're attacking farmers by campaigning against the idea that a managed landscape is beautiful, and they want to make money from owning and controlling land but not working it. Natural capital. They are dismantling the vision of a people's land projected in the Scott Report for money. That's what this is about. I think if the committee of the Scott Report were brought back today, they would regret not being more forthright in their opposition to the aristocracy. What they wrote did scare them off a bit, but had they gone further, they could have prevented the conflict that we're having today. But equally, I think the reason these aristocratic ideas are getting so much traction today is because of the continuing cultural divide between town and country. The Scott Report didn't create a united British citizenry. There is no mutual understanding, tolerance or respect. This is a culture war and we are getting pummeled. Thank you for watching, I hope you enjoyed that. Discord link in the description if you want to talk about this stuff. Over the next couple of weeks we're going to have a look at how the ideals of the Scott Report spread around the country. And we'll also see what farmers themselves thought of their new urban neighbours who moved out into the villages after the war. I'll see you then.
But basically, of course, we're agricultural. The town's grown out of the soil. And most of the jobs we do have some connection with it. Bill Garson's forge, for instance. There's a lot of electric welding done there now, and most of it is repair and maintenance of the new mechanical implements used on the land. Like most towns in Britain, you'll find the old and the picturesque that still serves a use side by side with the new.